loneliness has its own sound. It's the soft rustle of pages turning, the rhythmic clicking of my laptop keys, and the silence echoing off the empty walls of our apartment. My name's James, and I'm the kind of writer who finds comfort in that emptiness. My books sell just enough to keep me comfortable, but far from the spotlight, just the way I prefer. The clock reads 11:47 p.m. Emily still hasn't shown up. Another night of eating dinner alone, leaving her untouched plate on the table. At the beginning of our marriage, 7 years ago, I used to eagerly wait for her. Now, I just leave the food there as a silent reminder that we still share the same roof, even though our lives have taken completely different paths. Emily is everything I'm not. Outgoing, ambitious, always surrounded by people. Her career in corporate consulting turned her into a stranger to me. When we met in college, we were the classic case of opposites attracting. Me, the introspective writer, her, the business student full of plans. The difference is that I stayed the same while she became an amplified version of herself, leaving no room for us. Photos from our wedding still hang on the walls like relics from a distant time I can't recognize anymore. Two smiling people who promised to share a life together. Now, we only share a mortgage. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. The sound of the door wakes me up. It's almost 2 in the morning when Emily enters, still on the phone talking about some crisis with a client. Her high heels echo on the hardwood floor as she walks by me in the living room without even looking in my direction. Yes, Tom. I'll be there tomorrow morning to fix it. Don't worry, I've got everything under control. When she finally hangs up, I notice she's more upbeat than usual. James, I need you to come with me to the company's annual party on Friday. It's not a request. It's almost an order. Something in her tone makes me look up from the book I was pretending to read. You know I'm not a fan of those corporate parties. It's important to me, she insists, tossing her shoes into a corner. I'm in line for a promotion, and the CEO is going to be there. I need to show that I have a stable life, a present husband, a prop. That's what I am to her. An accessory to her perfect professional image. Why now? You never cared when I wasn't at the other parties. Emily sighs, impatiently. This is different. Please, James. I need you there. Something in the fleeting vulnerability in her voice sparks a hint of what we once felt. Maybe it's a chance for reconnection. Maybe I can find my wife again in that distant look of hers. All right, I reply, ignoring my aversion to crowds. I'll be there. Her smile seems genuine, and for a brief moment, I catch a glimpse of the Emily I fell in love with. Emily's company headquarters is a monument of glass and steel, lit by blue lights that give the place an almost futuristic look. I feel uncomfortable, in my suit that I rarely wear, while Emily shines in her little black dress, greeting colleagues with air kisses and rehearsed laughs. This is my husband, James, she keeps saying, as if introducing me as a curiosity. He's a writer. No one asks about my books. No one really cares. I watch as Emily moves gracefully around the room, while I stick close to the bar, my refuge among socially awkward people. Then I notice a man watching Emily. Something about his look bothers me. There's a familiarity that goes beyond the professional. Tall, impeccably dressed, with that kind of confidence bordering on arrogance. He intercepts Emily when she returns from the restroom, whispering something that makes her smile in a way I haven't seen in years. Michael, I hear someone nearby say. Always around pretty women. This Michael finally comes over to us with a champagne glass in each hand. He hands one to Emily, completely ignoring my presence. This song is perfect, he says, as he extends his hand to Emily. Shall we dance? Before I can process what's happening, Michael looks at me for the first time with a smile that never reaches his eyes. You don't mind, do you? It'll just be a dance. Emily should have said no. She should have reminded him that I was here. But that's not what happens. James doesn't mind, she replies, taking his hand. He prefers to watch from the sidelines. When I try to intervene, Emily gives me a cold look. Please, don't make a scene. It's important for my career. And so, in front of all her colleagues, my wife walks off arm in arm with another man, leaving me alone with my humiliation. It wasn't just a dance. It was a public statement. And everyone in the room seemed to understand that. Except, apparently, me. The argument on the drive home is short and bitter. You're overreacting, Emily snaps as she throws her earrings on the dresser. It was just a dance. It was disrespectful, both on his part and yours. Michael is an important colleague. I couldn't just say no. Something about the way she says his name, Michael, with such familiarity makes my stomach sink. You two seem pretty close. She avoids my gaze in the mirror. We've worked on several projects together. That night, I sleep on the couch, replaying every detail of the party in my mind. The way Michael touched Emily's waist while dancing. The way she smiled at him. That smile that used to be mine. The next morning, when I wake up, Emily's already gone. On the table lies a cold note. I have meetings all day. Don't wait up for dinner. Sitting in my home office, instead of working on my new book, I start looking into things. Michael Reynolds, Senior Strategy Director. A Harvard grad. Married for 4 years to Rebecca Reynolds, a pediatrician. His LinkedIn photo shows the same. Arrogant smile from the party. Something's off. I'm a writer. Observing people and spotting patterns is what I do. And there's something in the way Emily and Michael behave that suggests this is more than just a professional partnership. I find Martin's card, a former cop I hired to research the backstory of a character for my latest novel. I stare at the phone for a long moment, weighing what I'm about to do. Part of me wants to brush off the suspicions, to pretend everything's fine. But I can't. I need to know the truth, no matter how painful it is. I dial his number. Martin? It's James. I need your help investigating someone. Martin is efficient. In just 2 weeks, he delivers a thick envelope with everything I need to know about Michael Reynolds, and more than I ever wanted to know about my own wife. Back in my office, I go through the photos, the recovered messages, and all the reports. Michael isn't just Emily's lover. He's a serial predator with a pattern. 3 sexual harassment complaints from previous jobs, all mysteriously pulled. Cases involving at least 2 other women in the company besides Emily. And of course, a wife at home completely oblivious to it all. The photos of Emily entering a hotel with him on 3 different occasions feel like stabs in the heart. The text messages between them, explicit and intimate, reveal an affair that's been going on for almost a year. My husband doesn't suspect a thing, one of her messages says. He's too busy with his books to notice. I almost laugh at the irony. The observant writer who couldn't see what was happening right under his nose. But the most telling part is Michael's pattern with his victims. He seduces them, uses his position in the company to promise promotions, then discards them when he's bored. 2 female employees left the company after breaking up with him. A third was transferred to an office in another state. In his messages, to Emily I recognize the same empty promises, the same manipulation. She's just another name on his list, even though she seems to believe she's special. I put everything back in the envelope, feeling a strange calm wash over me. The pain of betrayal is real, but now I have clarity. This isn't just about revenge, it's about justice, about restoring balance. I open my laptop and start planning methodically, just like I would plot one of my novels. Michael Reynolds has been destroying relationships, careers, and lives with impunity for far too long. It's time for someone to do something about it. I've always been methodical in my writing, building layers of narrative with patience and precision. Now, that same approach is being applied to real life. Michael Reynolds believed he was above consequences, protected by his charm and position. I was going to prove him wrong. I started by creating a detailed timeline on the wall in my office, the same one I used to structure my novels. Photos, documents, messages, all connected by strands of colored string. Emily rarely came in here, and on the few occasions she did, I covered everything up with a big map of a fictional city from my new book. The first stage of the plan was the most delicate. Rebecca Reynolds, Michael's wife, a dedicated pediatrician who, according to Martin's investigation, donated much of her free time to a children's charity. She didn't deserve the husband. She had. I created an anonymous email and carefully drafted a message. I didn't want to be cruel or vengeful, just to lay out the facts. I attached some of the less explicit photos and carefully selected excerpts from messages that proved the affair, but spared unnecessary torturous details. I believe you deserve to know the truth about your husband. These pieces of evidence speak for themselves. I'm sorry. My finger hovered over the send button for almost an hour before I finally pressed it. I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected, just a melancholic emptiness at having to be the one to shatter her world. But the truth had to be told, if not by me, then by someone else, perhaps in a harsher way. The second stage involved gathering more information. Martin had uncovered some worrying patterns, but we needed testimonies. Using a female pseudonym, I created profiles on career forums and corporate support groups, specifically searching for former employees of Emily's company. It was surprisingly easy. 3 women shared experiences with a predatory executive who, without naming names, clearly described Michael. One of them, Jasmine, agreed to a private conversation after a few weeks of exchanging messages. "I never managed to prove anything," she wrote. "He was always careful, making sure there were no records. And when I tried to talk to HR, they casually mentioned I was still on probation and could be fired without cause. And what if I told you I have proof against him?" I replied. There was a 2-day digital silence. Then, I'd be willing to testify. The final piece of the puzzle came when Martin discovered that the company had a zero-tolerance policy for undeclared relationships between supervisors and subordinates. Michael was technically senior to Emily in the hierarchy, even though he wasn't her direct boss. Both had violated the company policy by not disclosing their relationship, but Michael's history with other employees turned it from a mere bureaucratic violation into a pattern of abuse of power. Meanwhile, at home, I kept to my usual routine. Emily was more absent than ever, often working late. I pretended to believe her, offering blank smiles when she mentioned important projects with the team. When I asked about Michael, she would look away and say he was just a smart colleague. With every lie, my determination grew. Not because of jealousy or anger. Those feelings had long faded. It was about dignity, about justice. For all the Jasmines who had been silenced. With meticulous attention to detail, I organized every document, every testimony, every piece of evidence into separate folders. One for Rebecca, one for HR, one for the board of directors, and one final folder for Emily. Rebecca reacted much faster than I expected. 3 days after receiving my email, she confronted Michael. I didn't witness the confrontation, but its consequences echoed throughout Emily's office. In one night, Rebecca emptied their joint accounts, changed the locks on the house, and hired one of the toughest divorce lawyers in town. That night, Emily came home visibly shaken. "Michael's a mess," she commented while pouring herself a generous glass of wine. His wife found out things about him. "What kind of things?" I asked innocently, glancing at her over my book. "I'm not exactly sure. Something about inappropriate behavior at work." She avoided my gaze, downing half her glass in one gulp. Her fingers drummed nervously on the table, a habit that always betrayed her anxiety. "I hope it doesn't affect those of you who work with him," I remarked. "I can't see why it would," she answered too quickly. It was time to move to the next phase. Using 3 different identities, a former employee, a concerned current employee, and an anonymous informant, I sent detailed reports to HR. Each email contained different pieces of the puzzle, carefully written to appear as if from distinct sources, but together providing a complete picture. At the same time, Jasmine and 2 other ex-employees filed formal complaints, encouraged by the promise that there was evidence backing up their stories. The coordinated barrage of accusations made it impossible for the company to ignore the issue. 3 days later, Martin informed me that Michael had been called into an emergency meeting with legal and HR. That night, Emily came home pale, her eyes red from crying. "They suspended Michael today," she said, tossing her purse on the couch. "They're investigating claims of sexual harassment and abuse of power." "That's awful," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. "Do you think he's guilty?" "Of course not." Her response was quick and defensive. "It's all just a big misunderstanding. Probably a spurned employee trying to get even." "Or several," I commented casually. Emily looked at me surprised. "What do you mean?" "I've read about cases like this. It's rarely just one person making accusations." For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. The following week, the investigation moved quickly. The board, worried about potential lawsuits and damage to the company's reputation, conducted a swift process. Jasmine and the other women were heard. The evidence I provided anonymously was scrutinized. Michael initially tried to deny everything, but the sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. When confronted with the explicit messages exchanged with subordinates, including Emily, he shifted his story, claiming that every relationship had been consensual. The company wasn't buying it. The relationship policy was clear, and Michael had repeatedly violated it. On a rainy Tuesday, he was fired for cause. His office was emptied while he was in an HR meeting, his belongings handed over at the reception in cardboard boxes. The empire he'd built over the years crumbled in an afternoon. I watched it all from a distance through Emily's frantic phone calls with colleagues and Martin's discreet updates. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I'd feel, only a strange sense of justice being done, not just for me, but for everyone Michael had hurt. That night, Emily was devastated, but still trying to maintain appearances. "It's so unfair," she kept saying, pacing back and forth in the living room. "They didn't even give him a chance to defend himself properly." There must be some pretty convincing evidence, I suggested. What kind of evidence could they possibly have? She asked, more to herself than to me. I just shrugged and went back to my book. The next act was about to begin, and Emily still didn't know she was one of the main players. The storm that took Michael down wasn't going to leave Emily unscathed. She was part of the same system that had protected him for so long, and, inevitably, would be hit by the same winds of change. The call came on a Thursday morning. Emily was in the kitchen making coffee when her phone rang. I saw her face go pale as she listened in silence, occasionally murmuring, "Yes," or "I understand." When she hung up, it looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "What happened?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I'm suspended," she said in a low, almost inaudible voice. "Pending an investigation." "Why?" Emily slumped in the chair across from me, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "Apparently they found evidence of a relationship between Michael and me." "You had an affair?" I asked with the calm of someone who already knows the truth but wants to hear the confession. She hesitated for just a second before denying. "Of course not. They were just work messages that could be taken out of context." That was Emily, denying everything until the very end, even when backed into a corner. Once, that stubbornness was what drew me to her. Now it only showed how far apart we had grown. "Why didn't you tell me you were working so closely with him?" "I didn't think it was relevant," she replied, avoiding my gaze. The next few days were a nightmare for her. Confined at home while the investigation continued, Emily swung between bouts of anxious energy and deep melancholy. She spent hours on the phone with colleagues trying to figure out what was happening, or with her lawyer discussing defense strategies. A week after her suspension, things got worse. The company's legal department recovered deleted messages from the corporate server. Messages that Emily and Michael had exchanged using their work emails. Messages that completely corroborated the evidence I had provided anonymously. "They have everything," she said one night after yet another long conversation with her lawyer. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair disheveled. All the messages, scheduled meetings during work hours, professional decisions that benefited the projects we were involved in. For the first time, there was no denial in her voice, just defeat. "What's going to happen now?" I asked. "My lawyer thinks I'll be fired for cause, just like Michael. I'm trying to negotiate a less traumatic exit. Maybe a voluntary resignation that won't completely ruin my career." She looked out the window at the lit-up city. 7 years at that company, James. 7 years building a reputation, climbing the corporate ladder step by step. And now, for a moment, I felt something like compassion. Emily was reaping what she'd sown, but I couldn't deny that the price was steep. Her identity was so intertwined with her career that losing one meant losing the other. But then I remembered the messages I had read, how she talked about me to Michael with disdain and condescension, how she planned her meetings while I waited alone at home. That momentary compassion gave way to determination. 2 weeks after the initial suspension, the decision came. Emily wouldn't be fired. Instead, she'd receive an unpaid suspension for 3 months and be transferred to a different department with a demotion. That long-awaited promotion was now out of the question for years, if it ever was possible. "This is the best they could offer," she said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and bitterness. "At least I still have a job to go back to." What Emily didn't know, and what I didn't mention, was that this mercy, likely, came because several other women in the company had been affected by Michael. The board was trying to limit the damage and avoid lawsuits over a hostile work environment. Emily was simultaneously a victim and a collaborator, a complexity that made her situation legally delicate for the company. That night, while she slept exhausted after weeks of stress, I prepared the final envelope, the one I had saved for the right moment, not out of cruelty, but necessity. It was time for Emily to face not only the professional consequences, but the personal ones as well. I chose a Sunday for our final conversation. A calm day, free from the pressure of outside commitments. Emily was on the sofa, leafing through a magazine absent-mindedly as she tried to project an image of normalcy that no longer existed. I put the envelope on the coffee table, the subtle sound of the paper against the glass making her look up. "What's this?" she asked, her voice of disinterest barely hiding her apprehension. "The truth," I replied simply. Something in my tone must have conveyed the gravity of the moment. Emily closed her magazine and picked up the envelope with hesitation, as if it might contain something dangerous. In a way, it did. As she opened it and began to go through the contents, photos, printed messages, reports. Her face went through a range of emotions: confusion, shock, shame, and finally, a defensive anger. "You were spying on me?" she asked, her voice trembling between indignation and fear. "I hired an investigator after that company party," I admitted calmly. "After Michael invited you to dance right in front of me and publicly humiliated me." "That's an invasion of privacy," she protested, getting up. "It's illegal." "Probably," I agreed. "Just like it's unethical to have an affair with your supervisor and lie to your husband over and over." Emily looked again at the photos. Her and Michael checking into hotels, stealing kisses in a secluded restaurant, getting out of her car in a lonely parking lot. "How long did you know?" she finally asked in a nearly whispering voice. "Long enough. It was you, wasn't it? You sent the evidence to the company, to his wife." I didn't reply, but my silence said enough. "Why, James? To punish me? To get revenge?" I took a deep breath, gathering thoughts I'd been refining for weeks. "It wasn't just about us, Emily. Michael had a history of predatory behavior, with women at work. He used his position to manipulate, harass, and then discard them. You weren't his first, and if no one did something, you wouldn't be his last." "I wasn't a victim," she protested. "It was consensual." "Maybe for you, but what about the others? The ones who got transferred or left the company after he grew bored of them? The ones whose harassment complaints mysteriously vanished?" Emily sat down again, the weight of reality finally hitting her hard. "I didn't know about that," she murmured. "I didn't want to know," I corrected. "Just like I didn't want to see what was happening to our marriage for all these years." A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the distant sound of children playing in the park filtered through the closed windows. A reminder that the normal world was still on, oblivious to the collapse happening inside our apartment. "And now?" she finally asked, her voice devoid of the confidence it used to carry. I pulled another envelope from the inside pocket of my coat, thinner, but more definitive. "I talked to a divorce lawyer. These are the terms I'm proposing. They're fair. I don't want to hurt you financially. Just move on." Emily took the envelope, but didn't open it. "I always thought you were incapable of something like this," she said with a bitter laugh. "The quiet writer, the understanding husband who never questioned my absences or crazy hours. I thought you were harmless." "You mistook patience for weakness," I replied, "and respect for your space for indifference. I always cared, Emily. I just stopped showing it when I realized you stopped noticing." She finally opened the second envelope and quickly scanned the documents. "We don't have to decide anything now," I continued. "Take all the time you need to review them with your lawyer. I'll be staying at Martin's apartment for a few weeks to give us both some space." As she packed a small bag, Emily stood motionless in the living room, surrounded by the evidence of the choices she had made. There were no shouts or dramatic tears, just the solemn silence of two strangers acknowledging the inevitable end of a shared journey. Before leaving, I stopped at the door and looked at the woman who once was the center of my world. "I'm sorry we've come to this, Emily. Truly." For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the young woman I'd fallen in love with. Vulnerable, genuine, but it vanished quickly, replaced by the mask of composure she had perfected over the years. "I'm sorry too, James," she replied softly. "For everything." I closed the door without looking back. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. 6 months passed since I left our apartment that Sunday afternoon. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks ago, a surprisingly civil process, given everything. Emily moved to another state, accepting a position at a smaller company, a necessary fresh start after the scandal that, inevitably, leaked through the corporate grapevine. As for me, I rented a small house near the coast. The sound of the waves provides the perfect soundtrack for my new novel, the first in years that doesn't feel forced. The words now flow naturally, perhaps because I finally lived a story worth telling. Michael disappeared from view. His divorce was far less amicable than mine, according to Martin. Rebecca ended up with nearly everything: the house, the savings, even custody of the dog. The last I heard, he was trying to restart in another city, but his reputation preceded him. The carefully built power he wielded crumbled like a house of cards. On my daily walks along the beach, I often think back on everything that happened. Not with regret, but with the clarity that only distance brings. I've drawn 4 key lessons from this life-changing experience. First, respect is the foundation any relationship should be built on. Emily and I gradually lost that, so slowly that we hardly noticed it until it was too late. She stopped respecting my career and life choices. I stopped demanding the respect I deserved. Second, pay attention to the signs. Our marriage didn't fall apart suddenly. There were countless red flags along the way. Lonely dinners, superficial conversations, that growing feeling that we were strangers sharing a space. I ignored those signs out of convenience, fear of change, maybe even a misguided notion of commitment. Third, when confronted with injustice, a methodical approach is far more effective than a rash reaction. Had I confronted Emily at the first suspicion or made a scene at the company party, the outcome would have been very different. Patience and planning aren't signs of passivity. They're powerful tools when used correctly. And most importantly, the fourth lesson. There's a crucial difference between revenge and restoring your own dignity. What I did wasn't motivated by the desire to make Emily or Michael suffer. It was about bringing back the truth and justice, not just for me, but for everyone affected by their actions. Yesterday, I received an unexpected email from Jasmine, the former employee who testified against Michael. She's now at a new company in a leadership role. "Thank you for helping me find my voice," she wrote. "Some battles need to be fought, even when they seem impossible to win." Her words moved me more than I expected. In the end, maybe that's the real measure of what happened. Not the downfall of the guilty, but the restoration of the victims. The sun is beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. I close my laptop, satisfied with the chapter I just finished. My new protagonist is finding his way, just as I am. Tomorrow will be another day of writing, another day of rebuilding. The story of Emily and Michael is now just that, a story. Mine continues, with blank pages waiting to be filled. And for the first time in many years, I'm genuinely curious to see what comes next. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this.